Right. So this is today's wonderful lecture about the Greenland Vikings, and I have done this lecture a number of times in the past, and every time it's got a new direction. And this morning I was reading through another article, and I thought, I really want to tell you what's in this article, but the problem is when you prepare a lecture and you get new stuff in at the last minute, it sort of messes around with my formula. But I might actually sort of dip into that article. It's just got really nice stuff in it. So when I mentioned to Karen about the Greenland Vikings, what do you think? What conjures up in your mind?
I don't know really. I know about Vikings in general, but I didn't know. I'll tell you what, Carl, we've got a terrible echo here.
Yes, you do, because you've got two people in a room. Okay,
yes,
okay. No, that's fine, Karen. That's fine.
It might be best to choose somebody else rather than me.
Jane.
Yes.
Jane, that was really bad feedback, wasn't it? That was terrible. No, so Jane, it's just you and me, and Jane, you always bring out a calmness.
Oh, do I? Oh, I wish I felt calm.
So Jane, Greenland Vikings. What
Okay,
do
I
you
don't know much about them, but I seem to remember from somewhere that Greenland was green at that point.
Nice. Very nice point. Exactly.
And then maybe that time wasn't.
And that's a very good point. So what I'm going to do now, Jane, is I'm going to cut your mic, and it's just down to me. I'm all alone. Now, Greenland is, in the very nature of the word, it was once green. Some archaeologists may disagree, but what we do know is that the landscape of Greenland was a great deal more wealthier in trees and animals than it is today. Back 1,000 years ago, Greenland itself was not 10 degrees warmer than it is today, not 5 degrees warmer than it is today, but 1 degree warmer than it is today. And anyone that knows anything about climate and models will know that a 1 degrees difference in temperature can mean the difference between the waterfront at Barry and Cardiff being completely inundated with water or not. That's how much difference 1 degree in temperature makes. To Greenland, the difference in temperature over 300-400 years of 1 degree meant the difference between a civilization beginning and a civilization ending. The artifact in front of you is in fact made out of Walrus Ivory. And Walrus Ivory, some archaeologists believe, was the main trade object of those from Greenland trading with the rest of the Western Hemisphere. Walrus ivory itself is very durable. It's much easier to carve than elephant ivory, and much can be said in the way of artifacts associated with walrus ivory. In the archaeological record, from the 1000s to about the 1300s in Britain and Scandinavia, 90% of all artifacts found in archaeology made of ivory come from Greenland. There was, if not hundreds of tons of ivory from Greenland traded every year, and then it went down to a small trickle. Now, this is quite ironic that it's showing walrus ivory carved into a walrus, and the irony isn't lost on anyone. It's the type of thing. But what's happening is the best thing to do with ivory is to trade it in its most rawest form. Don't trade it into the objects. Let the person receiving those objects do the carving. So what we do then find is an archaeologist excavating. And this archaeologist excavating is excavating in the southernmost of the settlements associated with the Greenland Vikings. We have three main settlements, and this is where it gets confusing. And we will look at a map in a moment. The eastern settlement, which is a southern settlement, and the middle settlement being the middle settlement, and the western settlement being the northern settlement. It gets very confusing that way. But then again, when you look at the geography, you'll probably understand why. Excavations in Greenland haven't been undertaken in a great deal of detail until the 1970s. And when we go back to the 1920s, archaeologists did go to Greenland, but it was to recover some artifacts that were being eroded away by the sea. And those artifacts are some of the greatest artifacts to be ever excavated from a Greenlandic context. But the greater artifacts, again, could come from elsewhere. Now, I've got a set of reproduction Lewis chess pieces, and hopefully, Jane, I'm going to bring your image back on. So, can you see my little Lewis chess figures? Yeah. Can you see them? Thumbs up. Yeah. See that detail? Yeah. Now. Okay, I'm going to put your mic back on. You can't see it. Right, okay. All right. The Lewis chess piece is in front of my face. You can't see them. Look.
I can see a man in an orange cagoule.
But you can't. But what about my image? You can see my image, Sue? Can you see these figures? Right, okay, then you can't see it, Jane. But what I'm actually holding up is the reproduction Lewis chess pieces. And these were found on the Isle of Lewis. These were found in the 1800s. And when they were found in the 1800s, the guy who found them, you can't make it up, a certain Mr. McTavish, thought that these were little figures that represented the fairy folk, and he ran away at that point. But then when he looked back in, he found out that these were little carved figures for a chess set. Well, actually, there were more than 100 pieces found, and as you know, that you need a hell of a lot less than 100 pieces in an average chess set. And it was found out that these were a collection of a trader that was trading these chess pieces, and these are all made out of Walrus Ivory. And it's likely you can get maybe a whole set of Lewis chess pieces out of 2 tusks of Walrus Ivory from one single beast. So you can see I've got a king in front of me. You can see I've got a queen. And then you've got a bishop. Then you've got a rook. And then you've got the little pawns. And these, you can probably get a complete set out of the tusks of one walrus. Anyway, back to the image in front of you. The archaeologist excavating in a cagoule is excavating on Greenland in the eastern settlement, the southernmost settlement. And that ground that he's excavating is actually permafrost. And back 1,000 years ago, the landscape of Greenland wasn't the permafrost that the archaeologist is excavating at this present day. And you know what? Chris asked me to do a little favor. And that little favor is in connection with some sagas that we associate with the Greenlanders. And one such saga discusses Thorvald's expedition to Greenland. And Thorvald's expedition to Greenland, a translated version from a work of Beamish, goes as follows. And the document that you're seeing in front of you is one such text that defines what I'm going to read out now. It's said of Leif Erikson, written down by the writer Beamish in 1864, decoded from the Greenlanders' sagas. It says as follows: "The nature of the country was, as they thought, so good that cattle would not require house feeding in winter. For there came no frost in winter, and little did the grass wither there. Day and night were more equal than in Greenland or Iceland." But we do believe that he is actually describing Greenland or one of the islands nearby, a little bit further over. Thorvald's expedition is discussing Greenland precisely. Thorvald said in the saga, "Here it is beautiful, and here would I like to raise my dwelling." Then went they to the ship, and saw upon the sands within the promontory 3 elevations, and went hither, and saw there 3 skin boats, canoes, and 3 men under each. Then divided they their people, and caught them all except one, who got away with his boat. They killed the other 8, and then went back to the cape, and looked round them, and saw some heights inside the firth, and supposed that these were dwellings. What they're describing, they're actually describing the Inuit. So we know full well that the Inuit are at Greenland, and there is something else that needs to be said as well, a speculation and something in these annals as follows. Another name from Greenland is Vineland. There has been much speculation on the grapes of Vineland. It seems unlikely that the Norsemen travelled far enough south to find wild grapes in large quantities. On the other hand, it speaks of grapes in Vineland, so that if the grape idea is a fantasy, it is a very early one. The Norsemen were probably unfamiliar with grapes at one point. The saga speaks of chopping vines, and it is possible that they mistook another type of fruit, perhaps gooseberry, for grapes, and names the country Vineland. In the spring, the expedition then sets back. Now, is the saga in fact talking about Greenland, or is it in fact talking about land further south in the Americas? The fact of the matter is, another idea is that Greenland could in fact be the place of the Vinland that is being described. It may not, it could be. But the interesting thing is that even as we start, the landscape is very different from the frozen permafrost landscapes that we see today being the landscape of Greenland. So if we can, what I'm gonna do now is I'm going to go to my tried and tested article whenever I look at Greenland. This is a wonderful article. It's written about 20 years ago. It's entitled "The Fate of Greenland's Vikings" by a certain Dale Brown. And I will come in and out of this, and I will hopefully go to the other piece that I've been reading about only today. When we think about the archaeological excavations at Greenland, some people call it the farm under the sand, others the Greenland Pompeii. The archaeology at Greenland, being excavated by the archaeologists, is in a fine state of preservation. It was once the site of a Viking colony founded along the island's grassy southwestern coast that stretches in the fjord between the glaciers and the sea. That's what it's like today. That landscape has been excavated from the 1990s, finding rooms, and rooms that would have had stone walls and a turf roof. As the archaeologists dig through the permafrost and remove the wind-blown glacial sand that fills the rooms, they find various well-preserved fragments, not just of pottery and iron knives and whetstones, soapstone vessels. Soapstone is a type of really soft stone. But they also find the remains of the looms and the cloth and the double-edged combs dating all the way back to the period that this building was abandoned. Now, we talk about 1,000 years ago. The archaeology that we're talking about being excavated takes us to the time that the Western settlement in the northern part of Greenland, associated with the Greenland Vikings, was being abandoned around 1350, which happens to be a similar date that the plague hits Europe. But we don't want to bring in the plague into Greenland at this stage. Whoever lived here departed so hurriedly that they left their antler arrows, all still intact, the iron and the antler-tipped arrows, the arrows and the shafts that they abandoned that day. So they abandoned quite quickly because the landscape had become too harsh for them to live amongst. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the image again. And that itself is the remains that we're talking about, the very remains that are the epitome of the Greenland landscape. You're looking in through a threshold, a doorway, which is quite low lying, looking out to a mountain range, looking at a fjord. But this landscape, when the Vikings originally got there, for them to be able to build and for them to have wood for their fires, for them to be able to make tools and so on, to do repairs to the vessels, there must have been plentiful amounts of woodland within this landscape. And this is the map that I'm sure Ellen would be shouting out at. I want to see the landscape that we're talking about. If we want to sort of express this in a more precise way, let's get my annotations up there. To give you an idea of distance, the distance between the eastern settlement and the western settlement is roughly about 300 miles in distance. So you can imagine that that's 300 miles, that's another 300 miles, probably 700 miles, 800 miles from Greenland before you start to get to the tip, if not the eastern settlement, the most southern settlement of the Greenland occupied landscape by the Vikings. It gets very complicated in my text when it talks about Nordic Vikings and Danish Vikings, when Greenland in 1814 become part of the Danish Empire. But we'll just refer to them as Vikings. Vikings who originated from the Scandinavian world. So looking at this, we can probably work out that we've got three key settlements. As we mentioned, the eastern settlement, the southern settlement, the western settlement, northern, and the middle settlement being the middle settlement. And if anyone's wondering at the map why it's called the Labrador Sea, it basically means the land sea. Don't ask. And what we're talking about is that the first person to ever reach the tip and then create a settlement at the most southern point of the Vikings in Greenland was Eric the Red. We believe that they had a red beard and red hair. He originally went there in 983, and settlements were being founded by about 985, 986 by Eric the Red. He was a pagan, and his wife was a Christian. And that leads us in a little bit further into the story that we're going to come on to. And it's the most famous Leif Erikson. Again, he will come into the story. We've already mentioned Leif Erikson. It's believed that Leif Erikson is sailing out and going all the way down the coastline. Is he describing Greenland as Vinland, or is he describing a land further south as being Vinland? The jury is out on that. But what we do find slowly but surely is up and down the coastline, what we do find is that there is to be found Viking artifacts all the way further up north and all the way down this coastline. So are these ended up there due to settlements? We do actually have Viking settlements now in Canada and evidence in the United States as well. When they got there, the jury's out, but we do actually have artifacts found up and down the yellow line that you can see on the map. So what we then find is another more precise map. And what is to be said is that all of these little dots represent individual farms. Okay. These are the first, down in the south, these are the first farms being established. And it's a long distance between the south and the northern settlement, about 300 miles, which is just over half the length of from Land's End to John O'Groats, which is quite a distance. You're not going to travel over land. You're going to use the vessels, which probably need regular repairs. To sort of go to the end of the lecture, so you know what we're talking about when I'm describing it, it's likely that the Western settlement after 350 years was abandoned. So the first, if we look about 1,000 years AD, that's when the first settlement, the Western settlement, has been established. By 350 years later, it's been abandoned. It's only until 1540 that finally the Eastern settlement is completely abandoned. And then we look at a piece of text that I wasn't going to read out today. But sometimes when you're lecturing, you almost feel a need. And I feel a need to do this. In 1721, a missionary known as Hans Egede sailed a ship called the Hope from Norway to Greenland. In his heart, he felt he was going to find some Greenlanders, seeking Norse farmers who Europeans hadn't heard from in 200 years, in order to convert them to the new Protestant faith. Because when you think about it, these Greenlanders would have obviously been Catholic, and without the link, without the sense of conversion to Protestantism, he was going to do that. That's Hans' job. Look at the map. He explored iceberg-dotted fjords that gave way to gentle valleys and silver lakes that shimmered below the massive ice cap. But when he asked the Inuit hunter he met about the Norse, his kin, they showed him crumbling stone church walls, the only remnants of 500 years of occupation. He wrote, "What has been the fate of so many human beings, so long cut off from the intercourse with the modern civilized world? Were they destroyed by an invasion of the natives?" he asked. "Perished by the inclemency of the climate?" he asked, "and the sterility of the soil?" Archaeologists have always wondered. They've always asked those questions. Was it the Black Death? Was it the plague reaching Greenland in 1402? Was it in fact Basque pirates? Did they wipe out the population? The responsibility has been pinned at the door of the Little Ice Age, which was slowly building up until 1315, the date that the Little Ice Age hit the Western Hemisphere. It had a dramatic effect. And the parallel on today is quite chilling. A slow climatic collapse leading to a great pandemic. in the 1980s, we were warned that there are global changes occurring. The politicians didn't listen, people didn't listen. And then what we have 30 years later, we end up with a pandemic. Strangely enough, in 1315, the Little Ice Age begins. In the Western Hemisphere, in 1347, there's a pandemic that wipes out 2/3 of the European population. And it comes in 3 waves. We've only just done the one. Lots of climatologists and virologists believe that we've got another 2 great waves of a pandemic. And this has all been seen in the past. And we as humans have created this pandemic because we see this in the archaeology. You can nod your heads and say no, but by learning from the past, we can hope to learn to change our future. We've still got hope. Sorry to be the forebringer of bad news, folks, but this is reality. Going back again to my notes, the disappearance of the Greenlanders has intrigued students of history for centuries. One of the places of blame was in fact the Inuits. It's believed that the Skraelings, that the Vikings called them, wiped out the Greenlanders. Others believe no. One thing to be said is that archaeologists and historians like to blame things that they don't understand. In that description that we had earlier on about the 3 boats and Inuits being killed, the Greenlanders are doing the killing. And then somebody shouted at me on Tuesday, and they said, actually, Karl, don't you think that the Greenlanders learnt from the Inuits? And the answer is yes. It was probably a 2-way interaction. Back to 986. And this goes back and forth. I'm not apologizing for that. Of the first 24 boatloads of land-hungry colonizers that left Iceland in 986, the summer of 986, to meet with those that had been left behind by Eric the Red, they had gone to colonize new territory. By the time they got to Greenland, out of the 24 boats that Eric the Red set out with, only 14 had made it. Some had turned back. Some had capsized. All lives lost. But 14 vessels arrived. And you know what? When I do lectures, I do a lecture every week to a group of the young explorers. And when I asked them at the end, what did you learn from this talk? One of them said that Eric the Red set out from Iceland with 24 boats and only 14 made it to Greenland. And I thought, if that's all you've learned from this lecture today, I've really achieved something. And that is a really key point. But they did make it under the leadership of the red-bearded Eric. The colonists developed a little Europe of their own, only a few hundred miles away from North America, may I add. And this was a full 500 years before Columbus actually got there, and before Cabot got there, before any other European had set foot on the continent. They established dairy and sheep farms, 400 of them. You know, those little dots, I got a bit distracted on the map. 400 farms were established, 400 of them. And if we look a little bit more at this map again, the little dots, so the Western settlement, that's the biggest one that was abandoned first, but all these little outlying farms were abandoned before that because of the condition. And I've studied this church before. This is known as Bran Hillard Church, which we're gonna examine a little bit in detail. Now, when the colonists got there, not only did they introduce the dairy and sheep and the goats to the landscape, they busied themselves with Christianity. They built churches, a monastery, a nunnery, and a cathedral boasting a bronze bell and greenish tinted glass windows, the opulence of the Western world. But you know what? This was the same mistake that the founding fathers made when they went to North America. And why is that a mistake? Instead of using their time in taming and understanding the landscape, they turned to Christianity. They built churches. That's what the founding fathers did. And when you concentrate on religion and not looking after the landscape and yourself, that's your downfall. Any history book will tell you, when you look at Darien, which we're going to look at in a few weeks' time, the Scottish settlement that was established in Central America in the latter part of the 1600s, the 1690s. They built sort of a church, and they built all these wonderful things, when in fact the people were going to die because nobody had planted the crops. This is the Western mentality. And it was only those founding fathers that actually got to North America who actually chose to deal with the local people and to actually understand the local people and the landscape, and to actually take on board the turkey, which is a strange thing for me to say, but that's true, that they actually began to tame the North Americas. Those earlier founding fathers hadn't learned from the Greenlanders. If they had learned from the Greenlanders, there'd be a different civilization in North America today. However, initially, like any civilization, building their churches to protect them, churches with bronze bells and green tinted glass windows, they prospered. Colonies expanded, 400 little farmsteads, a peak population of 5,000. And you know what? They become fat with Christianity. They become with the fat of knowing what they're doing. They didn't need the Inuit. They butchered every single walrus that they could find. They butchered every narwhal that they could actually find in the sea. They butchered every polar bear that they could find. All for the exchange for falcons. All for the exchange for luxurious goods like raisins, nuts, and wine, and some tools, iron, and some timber. And you know what? That's when they're making mistakes. They're using up all their resources. Do you know the fat and the blubber from the whale? The fat and the blubber from the seals that they're bludgeoning to death, and the walruses that they're bludgeoning to death and just leaving their carcasses. That's oil, and they chose to ignore that. They chose to decimate the landscape, and the Inuit looked on in horror. All the resources are going. Do you know what? I've got a bit of a hate for Westerners in North America with what they did to the Native Americans. I've got a great hate for Westerners in North America. They destroyed the environment for the Native Americans, and this is what the Greenlanders, the Western Greenlanders, were doing in the land that we're talking about today. Without my vitriol, I know the other week it was having a go at the English, and now I'm having a go at Westerners in North America. So let's just take that away. The major excavations were in the 1970s and in the 1990s. But what I would say, there were some earlier excavations that have already intimated in the discoveries in the 1920s. And there was a wonderful excavation at a place known as Bran Hillard, which is associated with that building behind. And when I excavated in 1932, Bran Hillard means steep slope. The Danish archaeologists not only excavated the remains of this church and another church, this other church had a turf wall around it to keep farm animals out. They also excavated a great hall. Bran Hillard, excitingly enough, was the farm of Eric the Red. And his son, Leif Erikson, would have been there as well. Just think, they found a site that's within history, within the pages of history, associated with Eric the Red. And they excavated the great hall that Eric the Red would have sang and drunk his various liquids, drunk his great wine from the Western world. This was a great hall they excavated with the fire pits in 1932, where they would have ate their meals around base, and people would have recited sagas. You know, those same sagas that I was filled with when I was a child by Magnus Magnusson, as I sat there listening to my radio. You know, I was in my bedroom, lying in my bed, and Magnus Magnusson was alongside me, telling me these stories. And it filled my mind, and those sagas, they're still fresh, about the fairy folk and about the explorers and about the rights and wrongs and all these wonderful things. This great hall, and they played board games. And behind the church, they found evidence of another later period when they'd run out of timber. And this was now the farm of Eric's family through the generations, probably from the 1300s now, not the 1000 that I've just been describing, 300 years on. And in this building, they found a stall building. And those stalls, the divisions within that building, the stall partitions were the shoulder blades from whales. So they'd run out of timber by 1300, and they were using whale bones for their buildings. It was now treeless in the 1300s. And then, close by, folks, in 1961, workmen excavated Thordhild's chapel. Who is Thordhild? Thordhild is the wife of Eric the Red. They excavated Thordhild's chapel and its immediate surroundings. And when they had excavated the chapel, excavating the ground around, they found 144 skeletons. Now, Thordhild's chapel, built by Eric for Thordhild, was a tiny horseshoe-shaped building. Eric was a pagan. Thordhild was a Christian. Thordhild tried to convert Eric to Christianity, and he refused to do so. But she's a redhead, and she gets her own way, as I find with Michelle always. But he didn't convert to Christianity. Instead, he built this chapel for Thordhild. So in other words, what we've not only got the wife of Thordhild represented, we've got Eric's hall, we've got everything that Eric built. We've got Eric in the history. It's so wonderful. And this little chapel itself was only 6.5 feet wide by 11.5 foot long. It was very, very small. And because it was so small, another building had to be constructed that could accommodate 30 worshippers. So they've got a hall, they've got a barn, they've got a chapel, they've got a church for these other worshippers. They've got a direct connection with history. What more could you have? This is like finding Richard III and his horse and all his weapons and his armor and a note pinned on his chest saying, "This is Richard III." This is what they found in the 1960s. Back to those bodies. The 144 skeletons that they found were tall individuals, were mainly tall individuals of typical Scandinavian build, as you see Scandinavians today. One male skeleton was found with a knife between their ribs. obviously a violent end, and they chose not to take the knife out. But this individual was buried with all the rites associated with a Christian burial. This is a Christian burial ground, church and a chapel. Eric's being buried somewhere else, or is he? Rather interestingly, the next point coming, but not yet. They also found within that burial area 13 bodies in a mass grave. And these 13 bodies in a mass grave all seem to be in their teens. Lots of them showed that they had head and arm wounds, suggesting that they all died in a battle, but they're still buried in hallowed ground. A battle, 13 people buried. Is this the cause of the destruction of the Greenlandic way of life? Because there's all this infighting between the eastern and the western settlement. Could that be a cause? I've always said that there's no good in war. War leads to decimations of population. War leads to the decline of population. And that's the terrible avenue that we're actually going down. Or is it? Let's not go down the rabbit hole at all. Alongside the church wall, this great church wall for these 30 worshippers, the most compelling finds were 3 skeletons. And they were interred close to the church wall because it's believed that these were special people. It's believed that those buried closest to the church wall will be first entered into the kingdom of heaven. It's also thought that on Judgment Day, these will be the first 3 to rise to lead the people at Judgment Day. Who are these 3 individuals? In the 1960s, they believed that not only was one of these bodies to represent Thorhild, they reckon they actually found the body of Eric the Red himself. And who is the 3rd person? The most famous son of the Norwegians, Leif Erikson himself. So I can't really say whether they've proved that or not, but isn't it great to think that we've got the bodies of the most important people in Greenlandic history? But I'm reminded of present times. These are also as important as the Inuits that occupy the landscape even today. Before we go on to another image, I would like to do this little passage here. With the islanders' early success came a desire to have some authority oversee the work of the church in Greenland. And you know what? I might have indicated that I'm not a fan of Christianity. I will tell you now, I believe that Jesus Christ existed. That's quite strange for an academic archaeologist. But lots of things to do with Christianity I feel are wrong in history. And one thing I would see is that with the islanders building their churches and their monasteries, instead of dealing with their landscape, planting new trees, looking after their animals better, planting more crops, they were obsessed by the fact that they needed a bishop to rule the Christian diocese in Greenland. So in the 1100s, instead of having the monks and the priests and all the rest of it, they said, we need a bishop, King of Norway, give us a bishop. And I tell you what, that was one of the death nails for the end of the Greenlandic people. The King of Greenland said, let's start again. The King of Norway said to the Greenlandic people, they said, right, what we'll do, I'll agree to send you a bishop. And the name of this bishop was Bishop Arnold. Bishop Arnold said to his king, the King of Norway, I do not want to go to Greenland. Please don't send me to Greenland. I am no good at handling difficult people. Please don't send me there. Because Bishop Arnold had heard in the 1100s that the people of Greenland had a very contentious reputation, a very contentious behavior. and they were not nice people to be amongst. And Arnold said, no, I'm not going to go there. But anyway, he ended up going there. And he had one of the finest farms in the whole of Greenland built for him. And a new cathedral erected from the wealth and resources of the people of Greenland, using the remaining timber from the trees that they were felling, using the finest local reddish sandstone, using the finest green glass from Europe. And it was going to be associated with St. Nicholas. Also, they had a great meeting hall erected, which could hold several hundred people. And if anyone's wondering, that would have required a lot of timber. So at this point, all the trees from Greenland, well, most of the trees from Greenland are being felled. And then a large barn for 100 cows was also constructed. And a huge tithe barn was also constructed. So all these massive buildings. So with that, the resources are going out on building these vast structures. And then the other death nail is that now people have to pay a tithe to the church because they've got a bishop. They've now got to pay a tithe to Rome, and they've got to now continue their taxes to the King of Norway. And they've got to keep a fat bishop at home in the finest farm. And you can see that with all their resources going out to things that they didn't really need, this is going to be a burden. The church originally uplifted the Greenlanders, but back in their context, not mine folks, their context, by the middle of the 1300s, the church owned 2/3 of the finest pasture in Greenland. And all the wealth of that pasture was exported to Europe. None of it was used to feed the people of Greenland. It all went to the church. It all went to Rome. And the church in Norway, those ties were onerous. And just think, some of the grain from Greenland was used to support the Crusaders in the Holy Land. Can you believe it? People at this point in the 1300s, they're starving in Greenland. And the church sends its grain to Europe to fight wars in Italy, to fight the heretics in Italy. This is disgusting, the way the church led its life within these lands. The church authorities, however, found it increasingly difficult to send bishops. So instead, what they did, they decided to take what they could from Greenland and not send any bishops at all. So the people of Greenland are getting really, really upset. They're feeling very sour. My notes say life went very sour for the Greenlanders in other ways. But we're not going to do that now. What we're going to do, I'm going to change the images that we're looking at. Let's examine those images. I'll come to a little bit more of this. So this wonderful church building, and there it is, Bran Hillard. You can see the steep slope. There's Bran Hillard, the very steep slope. But amongst that, there was earth, there were crops growing, there were trees growing. And where is it today? This is what humanity does to its environment. This is what we as humans can do. And that church, in the last days of the Vikings in Greenland, was nothing but a thorn in their side. Those windows would have had green glass in them. They're quite small windows because of the chills in the winter. Even though it's describing that there may not have been chills in the winter back 1,000 years ago. But by 1400s, it was getting very cold indeed, because of the little ice age starting in 1315. The walls would have been rendered and they would have been whitewashed. A church like this could have been seen for miles around. This is how wonderful we are as Greenlanders. And I bet you the Inuits looked on and thought, why are they building churches? You know, why are they wasting their resources? And you can imagine an Inuit looking and thinking, those Greenlanders are killing all our food. Oh, no, they're not. They're leaving the carcasses on the beach. So the Inuits would take the carcasses away It's a bit like what the horrendous American army did to the bison on the plains of North America. They slaughtered millions of them and left them rot on the plains of North America. You know, you can see some parallels there. Moving on. And this is inside the church. And I haven't got Pam's mic on, but Pam will recognize this as similar build as the church at St. Peter's at Brinner in the Rhondda Valley. That some people have actually been to the church where King Arthur was meant to be laid to rest in the valleys. This is very similar build. And you can see parallels. This is a type of building that you build in areas where it's a little bit cold, in upland areas. And this is exactly the same way that this is built from sandstone, just like the one in the Rhondda Valley. So very similar way of building. They're thousands of miles apart. And it probably, somebody said to me, they said, is it possible that they had you know, ground and then a first floor in this building? And I thought, actually, maybe they did, because it may have acted as a little bit of an archival structure above the church, or maybe that's just a light for a tall span building. Who's to know? Who's to say who's right? And there is one, that's a set of Walrus Ivory. We're going to go on for another 7 minutes, and then we're going to take a break. I want a little bit of a slurp. And I'm feeling a bit lonely at this point. So, Jane, can you put your mic on, please? Be nice.
Hello.
Hello, Jane. How is this sounding so far?
Very good, thank you. Very interesting.
Good. And Jane, don't show off too much. I would like to have you for the next 7 minutes or so. So,
Okay.
So what we're going to do now, we left off a few moments ago, and it said life went sour for the Greenlanders in other ways. The number of Norwegian merchant vessels at the beginning may have been one a month, which may not sound a lot, but one a month was a godsend. You guys know what it's like for isolation. I know as well. To be honest with you, I haven't seen another human being other than my family, even still for the past week. So I know how isolation feels like. However, these people were isolated. They wouldn't see another vessel for every month, but that was great. It contained everything that they needed. But as the 1200s came, that probably dropped to about 2 vessels a year. As the 1300s came, that dropped to 1 vessel a year. And Jane, I think you can understand how isolated people were finding that they wouldn't have any contact with the outside world. They only had contact with the outside world once a year, and then it became once every 2 years and once every 3 years. How do you feel that? How do you think that meant that these people felt?
Well,
Jane?
probably made them very depressed and introverted.
Yes, and that is a very good point. The islanders were cut off from the major source of iron and tools and wood and the other resources that they needed. It's said possibly that the women were so cut off from fashions in Europe that when the archaeologists were excavating in the 1920s off that beach that we're going to mention, it's likely that the costumes they were finding were 100 years out of date. So in other words, they were so away from trade with Europe that the fashions were 100 years behind in Greenland. They were very isolated. The other thing as well is, you're looking at the Walrus Ivory there. It was very prominent in the trade, the export. Now, if they hadn't have done the church thing in the way that they had, if they had gone to using all the resources from a walrus instead of butchering them on the beach, and you know, allowing some of the walruses to survive, if they went into exporting other things, they may have kept people in Europe interested in them, because in the 1300s there was an explosion in the trade of elephant ivory from Africa. It was easier to come by. You would just need to send a ship along the coastline of Europe into Africa, and then you could obtain elephant ivory, which would mean that the perilous journey to Greenland looked very unattractive when you could get this much easier from Africa. So the trade in Walrus Ivory started to ease. And then by the time you get into about the 1350s, 1400s, any ivory that you find in a British context is going to actually be African ivory and not Walrus Ivory. As the Greenlanders' isolation from Europe grew, they found themselves victims of a steadily deteriorating environment. We look at some tables after the break. Their farmland, exploited to the full, had lost its fertility. Erosion followed severe reduction in ground cover. The cutting of dwarf, willow, and alders for fuel and for the production of charcoal to use in the smelting of bog iron readily available in Greenland, but you needed the high temperatures to smelt it. So there's no timber around anymore. So what are they going to do? So they can't actually, and anyway, bog iron's not that good. It's quite softer, but they can't even manufacture their own tools anymore. They don't have this trade with Europe. Things are really starting to go, mind my French, tits up. Pollen analysis shows a dramatic decline in various natural species by about 1350. In addition, the livestock consumed any regenerating scrub, overgrazing, trampling, and scuffing by the Norsemen's sheep, goats, and cattle. The core of the island's livelihood left the core of the island a debased, desolate landscape. Jane, I've often asked people in Orkney and Shetland, why don't they plant more trees? And why is that, Jane? Can you give me an answer?
Well, I can only imagine because they don't think they would survive. It's not worth it.
Nope.
No.
They do survive. Well, the answer is sheep and goats.
All right. Okay.
They can't convince the local farmers to move to a more sustainable economy on Shetland and Orkney. And if they had gone to a more sustainable economy, away from sheep, away from goats, there would be a lot more trees in Auckland and Orkney and Shetland. So, you know, those are very important points. So we can see what's going on in Greenland now. Modern parallels. Greenland's climate began to change. The summers grew shorter and progressively cooler, limiting the time cattle could be kept outdoors and increasing the need for winter fodder. Earlier on, they didn't need the winter fodder. They could sort of graze outside, the sources tell us. During the worst years, when rains would have been heaviest, the hay crop would barely have been adequate to see the penned animals through the coldest days. Over the decades, the drop in temperature seems to have had an effect on the design of the Greenlanders' houses, originally conceived as single-room structures, like the Great Hall at Bran, Hillard, built for Eric the Red. They were divided into smaller spaces, and then into warrens of interconnected chambers with the cows kept close by so the owners might benefit from the animals' body heat. This sounds quite horrendous, but this is what was happening. You know, if anyone's ever been to Skara on Orkney, they will know that Skara is like a rabbit warren of rooms, interconnecting rooms and stuff, and very strange things. But in Greenland, it was a little bit more acute than that. I'm just going to change the images again, a little bit more text. And we've got this chart. What I want you to do is look at this, and we'll go to this after the break. But I'd like to mention one or two other things. When the Norsemen arrived in Greenland, it was plentiful. But what's happening now is that because they're wiping out the resources, they've got direct competition with the Inuits. Up until that point, the Inuits could stay over there. The Greenlandic Vikings could stay over here. But because all the resources are being wiped out by the Greenlandic Vikings, sending their resources out of the country, not eating what they needed and leaving the rest, they were in direct competition with the Inuit, and this was causing great problems. You know, killing all the walruses, the polar bears, and the damn right need from Europe and the tithes, simply meaning it was just outstripping everything. Eventually, it's likely that the Greenlanders thought, you know, we've got to, you know, retain the blubber and fill skins with oil and so on. But, you know, it was a bit too little, a bit too late. And what was probably happening is that the Inuits were coming down and looking at the impoverished Greenland Vikings and saying, look, you know, why don't we help? And the Greenlanders may have been agreeing to this or not agreeing to this. It's likely that they weren't. And it's likely that they weren't comes in after the break. So what we're going to do, we're going to if anyone doesn't want to see their photograph, then they need to cut their thingamajig. But I'm going to put all the screens on in a moment. But anything you would like to say, Jane, before we actually go to everybody?
Just that it seems like a very short period of time, in a way, between them actually going there and the climate becoming so bad.
Yes.
Hi. I've just been looking to see if I can find it, but I can't at the moment. I read a book, it was actually fiction, about the slave trade before the African-American slave trade of workers, women in particular, from Greenland and Iceland to Africa, sort of by the Africans. And a lot of them stayed there because, you know, even when they were allowed to go back, I think it was the King of Denmark or Norway that arranged for them to get back. But a lot of them stayed because they were actually treated reasonably well there, and they were much happier there than they were in Greenland and Iceland.
And that is a very good point. You know, in the week. In the week, I had to write a really emotive letter to the press on behalf of the political party I'm with, and when I did that, it sort of hit the nail. And the nail is that slavery is not just about one creed; it's about us. It's about all of us. And the reason why I got very upset was that it's only in the past decade that I found out that both lines of my family derive from Romany Gypsy. Which I've said a number of times. And one thing that makes me very, very angry is the 500,000 gypsies that were gassed in the concentration camps. I was looking at that and thinking, why is that relevant? And I actually got a bit further. They've been ignored in history. And then I actually saw that what was ignored in history is that in the Balkans, in 1851, people were taking whole Romany families and auctioning them in slave auctions in Europe. And this was in 1851. I've actually seen an advert for gypsies being put up for sale in slave auctions in 1851. So if anyone wants to scream and bandy on about slavery, being it just about them, makes me very angry. It's not just about one group of people, it's about all of us. This present situation is about us. It's about humanity. It's about the pain that all of humanity has shared, not just one group. And this is what's made me so angry this week. And I've just thought, right, it's about us and not one color. So what we're going to do, we're going to put everybody's, we're going to stop the screen sharing now. We will have everyone can have a little bit of a say, but keep it brief. Karen, everyone's got to unmute themselves. Anything anyone would like to say? Goff, you first.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just, it's by the way that when I was at sea, one of my officers on a ship I was on, a Scandinavian vessel, was from Greenland. He wasn't an Inuit, a native, and studied in Denmark. And he had some very interesting stories about their life at the present. But they're very reliant on Denmark at the moment, and very proud as well of being part of Denmark, as Donald knows.
Can I just make a point there? That is really strange you say that, because John, who is well, you know John, don't you, Goff?
I certainly do, yes.
He actually said exactly the same story that you've said. He went on a vessel that had Greenlanders on it, on a Danish vessel. And just think, John, Goff, the reason why you probably don't like John is he probably upset you on that vessel that day because you were on the same boat.
Well, if John was on my vessel, he'd be on the next plane home.
Right, okay. Because I've got a lot of voices to hear from, just probably one comment each. Keith.
Were the Inuit purely hunter-gatherers at this time, or did
Yes,
they
they
farm
were.
as well?
Yeah, yes, they were. What about you, Pam?
Just to say, I watched a programme on, I think it was YouTube, on Norway last night.
Yes.
And they grew vines and cherries. But it was interesting because it's.
Well, that says it all then. That says it all. What about you, Chris?
No, I'm just thinking perhaps the Inuit, I mean, the Vikings were only confined to a small area, so it doesn't mean that the Inuit weren't necessarily using the rest of Greenland, was it?
Yeah, well,
and avoiding the Inuit, the Vikings.
Yeah, obviously, I think what's happening is that the Vikings occupy the main hunting grounds, and I think that's the problem. Right. Up until that point, everything's probably fine, but it means that the key resources are being used up, and it was probably the Inuits that probably showed the Vikings where to go in the first place. Right, Rosamund, anything quick?
Oh, it reflects what's happening today. Yeah, same things, history repeating itself.
Yes.
And as in the Mexico one you did lecture the other week, they cut down all the trees and destroyed the landscape. It seems like the same thing happens in Greenland.
What about you, Jim? Anything?
No, nothing at the moment.
Okay. Sue?
Well, you've raised the subject of slavery, and modern day slavery is alive and well, and we all have to become much more effective at recognising what's going on under our noses here and now.
I completely, it is about here and now. Exactly. Ellen?
The Inuit were really lovely, a bit like the North American Indians. They fitted into nature and they never wasted anything.
Yeah.
Every animal they killed, or every narwhal or other creature in the sea, they revered, used every part of that creature, like sinews for sewing, the skin for making clothes. They didn't waste anything, and they didn't trash or use things. There was nothing left. They fitted in with nature. So the Vikings' way of life would be completely alien and abhorrent to them.
Yeah, it would be.
But they gave every animal, they thought every animal and every creature had a soul and was revered completely because of it.
That's very true. That I would concur all that. Andrea, anything? No? Okay. And what about you, Karen? Anything?
No.
All right then. Okay, I'll leave the mics on. You can all talk about the cricket score. I do believe that LBW's been bowled out.
Carl, I've got to go about. So.
Bye, Jane.
Oh, okay, Jane.
Bye.
Goodbye, glorious Jane. Bye-bye.
Coffee.
If everyone's listening, if anyone's got any books to donate to our portable library, let us know after the break. Anyway, I'm going to have a drink myself. I'm going to have some toast. I haven't even had my toast this morning.
That's really interesting. Oh, it's interesting. You've got a map of the world here.
Yeah, I see. You see Greenland. That's Greenland. That's
yeah, so what's that then? Baffin Island. Oh, that's Iceland. Oh, that's Iceland.
Yeah. Tiny. Greenland's quite soon.
So that must be a part.
Yeah. Lovely bit of Canada there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, isn't it fair and separate?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Oh, right.
Those are undiscovered. Yeah. Let's build a boat and go there.
Zoom recording. Right, good. It's now recording. So I think the main thing, Pam, is that what I've been trying to do today is make archaeology relevant, which I'm hoping to do more and more every week. And it seems that all the lectures that we've been doing recently have been very, very relevant. And I think the one that we looked at in regards to the English Armada with inventing history and hiding history is very relevant to the present crisis that society sees itself in. We don't need to spell that out. Now, we've got a chart in front of us, and I don't know if anyone's bothered to look at it in the break or think about it. But before we go on to this chart, I'm going to go back to my little bit of text. And my little bit of text is started off, and we ended the last bit about, you know, the Inuits, and Ellen mentioned the Inuits and so on. But the history in regards to the Inuits has been written down by the Greenlanders. And we don't know how much of this is true, but I'm going to read it all out. The Norse people, which are the forefathers for the Greenlander Vikings, in their documents back in Norway, the documents that have survived, tell a story of the Inuits as follows. An old story tells of hunters coming across small people known as the Skraelings, with whom the Greenlanders apparently fought. The texts say that when these people are hit, their wounds turn white and they do not bleed. But when they die, there is no end to the bleeding. A surviving Norwegian account. Another account is written, a description of Greenland, by a writer known as Bardson. He reported on the takeover of the Western settlement by the Skraelings, with the implication that they had killed the inhabitants. Now, the Western settlement, by about 1350, had been abandoned. But the historical accounts tell us that the Inuits are to blame for the wiping out of all the colonists at the Western settlement, most northern settlement associated with the Greenland Vikings. Years later, another source tells of a Skraeling and Inuit attack on the lower settlement, the eastern settlement, in which 18 Greenlanders met their deaths, and 2 boys and a woman were captured. However, that's the history. That's the written down history by the Norwegian chroniclers. But archaeologists have found no physical evidence of any of these massacres. There's no archaeological evidence that a single Greenlander's building had been taken over by an Inuit or had been set alight. There's nothing to back any claim of any mass destruction from the sides of the Inuit towards the Greenlander Vikings. Now, what I would like to do is to give the little chart on your screen some context as you're all looking at that, is the following reference from 1976 and 1977. And here we go, an archaeological reference. One valley farm being excavated showed how desperate the Greenlanders had become. The archaeologists tell us that the evidence in the building was of a freezing winter. One moment in time, one page in a book, one moment in time. The farmers killed and ate their livestock. Okay, well, what's wrong with that? But one important piece of evidence is that they ate all their livestock, even their newborn calves and a newborn lamb. Now, if you do that, you've got no animals for the following season to farm. There's no husbandry involved because you wiped out all the animals, leaving the bones and hooves on the ground. So as the archaeologists are excavating, they're finding the remains of the bones of these animals littering the building. And they also find the remains of a deerhound, a loved companion of the once occupiers of that building back in about the 1350s when this was excavated in 1976. They found the leg bone of a deerhound that had nicks in it from a knife blade. So they were eating the deerhound as well. So these were tossed on the floor. But there's more to this. This is quite bleak, Pam. Now there's more to this. In another farm nearby, they found out that the similar thing was happening, bones littering around the floor, showing that the people were starving. But they're starting to think that the bones of the animals that they found showed signs of undernourishment. So when they're eating the meat off these animals, they're not getting much meat. You're not going to get much meat off a newly born calf or lamb. Now, here's the crunch. Whoever killed the animals was living in squalid conditions. The bone-littered earthen floors had been spread on a regular basis with layers of insulating twigs. And in amongst the insulating twigs was not only the bones of the individuals, but the fecal matter of the individuals as well. They were defecating on the floor where they stood. They also found the remains of mice and many remains of the larvae egg sacs of insects such as flies. Now we know that flies are not native to Greenland, so these flies were obviously inadvertently traveled over to Greenland on the vessels. And these flies were a variety of different flies, indicating various insanitary conditions. Sanitation was dire. The radiocarbon dating was, as I said, the evidence tells us quite clearly that the evidence ceased in 1350, completely ceased in 1350. In amongst the evidence were rooms, and I'll say it in the right context, full of human shit. Alongside bones, alongside bits of material. These people were living amongst their own results of their lives, in a better way of putting it. Excuse for the use of my language, but it was in the right context. Now, these people did not obviously want to go outside. It was better to live amongst their own human waste than was to go outside. It got so cold in 1350. By 1350, the plague is rampant in Europe. The wiping out of 2/3 of the European population. And these searing conditions indicated that life ended in this building straight away. It was almost as if it got so bad that the people decided to leave the building, maybe in a warm patch in the midst of winter, jump into a boat and go elsewhere. It got so bad they couldn't cope with it anymore, and they just left, or they got outside and they just died. The main thing is dramatic. It tells us of a dramatic change. These people were in a hell of a state. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at this chart. Now, examine the chart with me, if you may, Pam. Are you still with me, Pam?
Yes, I'm here.
Pam, in a word, what does that sound like to you? Could you cope with those conditions?
No, definitely not. It's cold enough here in the winter, so I know what it's like. I wouldn't want to go outside.
Here we go. At least you've got a flushing toilet.
Yes,
Timeline. Timeline. You've had time to look at this timeline, and if we get my little sort of my annotating thing up here, and we go. So here we go. Fighting the big chill. We've just mentioned that. The climate worsened. In response, the Norse turned from their struggling farms to the sea. In other words, we've got archaeological evidence to say that they've got no more animals to eat. They've now got to eat They've got to eat beasts from the sea. Now, this is a very strange thing. Lots of societies are superstitious about eating food from the sea, but if you're desperate, you'll eat anything. Do you know what, right? About 2014, when I was a jobbing actor, I had whole months where I had no money. And I would actually go to bins, particularly supermarket bins, take food out, whether it's a meat pie or anything. I would make sure it was cooked. I'm a vegetarian and I would eat it, right? That's what I felt like when I had no food. But I was not living in these conditions. You will do absolutely anything. So it's very strange why they didn't turn to food from the sea sooner. And the evidence will be coming up. The chart as well shows us that winter temperatures drop below the long-term average by more than a degree halfway through the 500-year occupation, shown by isotopic oxygen isotopic data cores from Greenland. So the data cores are telling us of massive changes in the temperature, with great compaction of ice, less pollen, all these other things have been detected. Now, the date that I'm really looking for a massive change, ignoring that sort of 500-year thing, if by about here things are changing, but things massively start to change by here. This is 1315. The archaeological evidence tells us that the Western settlement is abandoned 1350. By here, we see the last recorded wedding taking place in Greenland, the last ever recorded wedding in Greenland. By here, just off the chart, the last body is found. Interesting. And the one thing that my other research tells me is that it's the main problem with the Greenland Vikings is this: they don't integrate with the Inuit sooner. They don't take notice of what the Inuits are doing, and they don't keep all their basically resources going out of a chain means that they're not going back in. So they should have kept more of what they produced. They should have used their environment a lot better than they did. They should have farmed rather than they should have farmed crops. They should have managed the trees and all the rest of it. They didn't do it, right? But even then, they had a chance of surviving. As temperature got really bad, as it started to get really, really bad, they should have turned towards the resources from the sea a lot sooner, and they didn't do it. They didn't look towards resources from the sea until a lot later, meaning that they've not got a mixed diet, meaning that they've exhausted one supply, they've exhausted another supply, and their exhaustion of their population, absolute exhaustion. You know, when they talk about the bodies, we mentioned those bodies found at Bran, Hillard. You know, people died in a battle. I don't believe that the people were massacred. There's no evidence that there was a wholesale massacre, as the other archaeologists said in my notes. So here we go. Those vessels, they're really good, but that's not a Viking vessel from the period of the 1400s or the 1500s. Things have changed. So in other words, when we get to the 1000s, Eric the Red is in a vessel like this, you know, low in the water, but they've got a nice keel. They're able to streamline through the water from prow to aft quite quickly. They're able to sail through. Great. But then you've got the heavy, some flat bottom boats that are not good in open water. And those trade vessels are not really good. And there's lots of going to be problems. So evacuating the island, the only way you're going to be able to evacuate the island is to use old vessels and to go in the other direction towards Newfoundland, the places that Leif Erikson was said to have gone to. And look at that headline there. Some of you know I don't like using the word Celtic. I used it in its right context last night, but the word Celtic, when we do this little article in front of us, refers to Britain, British, people of British blood when we do that article. But we're not going to do that yet, but we've got some bones there. I wanted to show you some bones. But here we go, back to what I was saying. So, now, in the southernmost tip of Greenland, there was a graveyard they excavated. And they excavated this. They excavated this in the second, in a second situation after the archaeology in retrospect. That's the archaeology being eroded into the sea. In 1920, there was a graveyard known as Herjolfsen, which is the lowest most settlement in the eastern settlement. Danish archaeologists reporting in the 1920s tell us that the cemetery was being washed away by the sea, and that bones and scraps of clothing from the graves were strewn on the beach. The archaeologists hurried to save what remained, and the skeletons revealed a hard life. Teeth showed heavy wear, so obviously heavy grain with lots of grit in it, and the joints of many adults were thickened by rheumatism. Now, if you look at what rheumatism exactly is, it's not like osteoarthritis, where you've got various other problems causing osteoarthritis. When you've got rheumatism, it can be caused by a load of different ailments. One form of rheumatoid thickening of the bones themselves could be caused by various different diseases, could be caused by natural causes, and so on and so on. So the evidence of the thickening of the bones and joints, these people were in agony when they moved their joints. Rheumatism caused agony, right? And there's lots of evidence at this site that they excavated in the 1920s from the bones. But the other amazing thing is, back to something I said at the beginning, I mentioned this to Jane, though the flesh had rotted away, the heavy woolen apparel that the dead wore from about the 1400s, 30 robes, 17 hoods, cowls, 5 hats, silk stockings, the robes were heavily patched, but they were in wearable condition. All of the stuff that they found indicated that they were 100 years out of date. The clothes were thought to reflect French and Dutch fashions, but they were so out of touch with the outside world that they were still repairing those clothing, or actually making clothing that they had that they had understood from before. The generous cut hoods provided ample covering for shoulders and featured a long decorative streamer. That long decorative streamer went out of date in the 1300s. These were being worn in the 1400s. Now, when you look at the Herjolfsen, the site, archaeologists look at the site and they think, right, the bodies that they found there don't tell of an annihilation. You don't annihilate people and bury them. That's a fact. Archaeologists wonder who might have come to Greenland after Norse traders ceased to arrive. What they're saying is that did anyone go there? Did anyone actually visit? If the population is going to be annihilated, right? How are people buried? If they still had a little bit of contact, who's going there? If the Norwegian traders ain't going there, who's going there? The answer is that it's likely that so few vessels were ever visiting Greenland at that point. Those that may have been visiting there have been taken off course, going elsewhere. It's even said that if you sail to Iceland, you can accidentally go off course and go to Greenland. I know there's hundreds of miles difference, but the wonderful Goff knows if you don't have a good navigator, you can go way off course. You can end up in the Pacific anywhere. Obviously, this is the Atlantic Ocean. You can go anywhere. If you get disorientated, you can end up in Greenland. And this is probably the only link that these people had. Now, they're starting to think that if there are bodies being buried there, who buried them? And did the people who buried these actually, on the first boat that they come across, did they actually leave? But the answer is that we've got evidence of people still living there in the 1500s. The other thing as well is, if they do want to leave, the only way of leaving the island is to jump on the vessel that's off course, because without nails, without bolts, and without woods, they would be unable to repair a leaky vessel. We've mentioned the plague, very fitting. Were the Greenlanders killed off by plague? I've intimated this one. Now, we know from writings 2/3 of the Icelandic population was wiped out in 1402 because of the Black Plague, the Black Death. 2/3 of the population of Iceland. It dragged on for 2 years. It would have taken one vessel, just one vessel from Iceland, with somebody carrying the plague to decimate the Greenlandic population. And why is that, Pam? Well, if you're living in close proximation with people, you can't avoid getting something like the plague. And one thing I failed to mention, which is in none of my notes, in 1315, folks, in Britain, the British population had got to 7 million people. I've said that a few times. When it got to 7 million people, lots of people were living alongside cattle, because in the 1300s, cattle was the big thing, not sheep or goats or pigs, cattle. People would bring their cattle indoors to keep them safe. Cattle, in their fecal matter, carry anthrax. So you can imagine that if you're bringing cattle over from Iceland and it's an anthrax carrier, and you're not living in sanitary conditions, you're going to end up with anthrax and you're going to end up dying in no time at all. So did a plague wipe out the Greenlandic population? The answer is, how could it when lots of bodies have been buried? But with small numbers of people, that might have been a factor. So it wasn't just the cold wiping out the population. There were other factors. You know, I've mentioned as well about the Basques, pirates going up there, wiping out people. But again, how do you explain the bodies on the beaches that have been found? Now, what we're going to do, I'm going to look a little bit at, my notes, and not my notes, my images. I got a bit lost then. So let's look at this one. Now, this is a rather interesting point. Greenland Vikings had British blood. So here we go. Norsemen who settled in southern Greenland carried British blood, more British blood than Nordic blood, but they were still decisively Scandinavian. An analysis of DNA from a Viking gravesite near a 1,000-year-old church in southern Greenland, Bran, Hillard, shows that those buried had strong links with Britain as well as Norway. The analysis performed by Danish researchers on bones from skeletons found during excavations in South Greenland revealed that the settlers had a mix of blood of the Nordic and British peoples. Danish archaeologists are currently conducting the first regional study of southern Greenland's original settlers that date back to 985 and the oldest church in southern Greenland. The research results haven't yet been published, but initial results somewhat surprisingly suggest that these people in the graves had more or less half Nordic and half British blood. We've always known that Norsemen traveled a lot, and we also know that the early inhabitants of the Faroe Islands and Iceland had traces of genes from Britain as well as Norway. But now we also have evidence of this in Greenland as well. Great. So in other words, how is this explained? Everything these people did, their culture, means of nourishment, and so on, was clearly Scandinavian. Early studies of populations living in the Faroe Islands and Iceland have shown that it was primarily the women who were of British origin. And it's also said that the Vikings may have come from Norway down past the British Isles, where they took women with them, and then continued on into the North Atlantic, the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Greenland. And this is what the DNA tells us. So so these are not just pure blood Norwegians. These are half-blood Norwegians and half-blood British. Now, just showing a few of the image, when I was actually trying to show the chess pieces earlier on, about the famous Lewis chess pieces, and telling you about that as I did, making a whole chess set out of a pair of walrus tusks. And this is rather interesting. And we mentioned earlier on, and if I follow this gently, what we've got, it's a little bit more acuter than this. The drop in temperature is a whole degree. It doesn't show it as clearly as that, but yeah, that is a whole degree. So over the 5 years, what we have got from the cores is that the temperature is slowly dropping. And then this is the point that I'm rather interested in here. Now, this is rather interesting because I've already told you that you've got something known as the mini ice age, right? Or the little ice age. So what's happening is sometime at the beginning of 1300s, temperature has really started to drop. Then there's a little bit of a change, probably a lot of, there's probably times when there's very wet winters. And then at the time of 1350, in this period of this little ice age, the mini ice age, temperature plummets by 1 degree. So within 100 years, temperature is really much lower than it had been before. And I've told you the dramatic effects on that. Now, the other thing I'd like to show you with this chart is that when we look at the diet, it's showing that early on there's very little in the way in the diet of people eating fish food. Now, to all of you that know the sea, it's full of fish, and it would be full of fish along the Greenlandic coastline, a huge variety of different fish. And it shows even after a short period of time, with some of the bodies, some of the individuals are not eating any fish. They like eating red meat. However, there are some people looking at the isotopic analysis from their bones, eating more fish than they, or as much fish as they're eating in comparison with red meat. But you can basically see that there's lots of people up to about this line that their diet composes very little in the way of fish. It's mainly a red meat diet. So as they start to look at the bones associated with the 1300s, for some reason, there are more and more people eating more and more fish. So by the 1400s, a majority of the diet is actually a fish diet. And then these are some of the anomalies. So why they're coming to eating fish later on is very, very difficult to understand when there's plenty of fish in the sea, plenty of it. If they hadn't have exhausted their cattle and their sheep, and they had grown crops better, and they would have adapted to the environment, there's no sign of any wholesale massacres. If they had traded with the Inuits and understood what was going on, maybe the Greenlandic population would have survived, but we're not at the end yet. So, again, moving on to, there's the archaeologist excavating. Again, at the southernmost settlement, you've got all these hills and stuff, very good for shelter. They're excavating some of the levels there, various different layers. Some of the more of these trade objects. This is, you can actually see, this is actually the head of the tusks. So the tusks themselves would come down, obviously, from here. And they're actually starting to carve some of the bone. You can actually see some carvings, but they abandoned this piece. And as we thread through, there they are. An artist impression of the walrus. And their clothing is slightly different from what we're describing later on. Obviously, some of the deer hounds that you can actually see in the illustration. This is obviously a modern illustration. And as we start to go on, I'm going to go back again. Hang on a minute. Stop that. Hang on. It's stopping me. Right. Okay. More of these carvings. And back to that. So what I'd like to do is go back to the archaeology as we sort of get to the end now. So we're gonna do this, and then I will have a good old chat with Pam. So with the absence of any archaeological evidence of such violence, leaves the tale unsubstantiated. You know, when we look at the churches, there's an interesting bit of information about the churches. When the archaeologists have excavated the churches, and they've excavated several in Greenland, it it looks as if at some stage, somebody had removed all the sacred objects from the churches. Now, why is this? Did they take them with them to North America? Were they taken by rapscallions? Were they looted by the Inuits? We don't know, but they weren't in the archaeology. We don't have the croziers. We don't have the altar trappings. We don't have any candles. We don't have any of that stuff. None of that is present. And in the last bit, in the end, the answer to the Greenlander question, Pam, okay, good. In the end, the answer to the Greenlander question may be a lot less dramatic than the theories that have surrounded it in mystery. The excavating evidence proposes that the Norsemen lost the ability to adapt to changing conditions, as I've already mentioned. Archaeologists have said that they were victims of hidebound thinking and of a hierarchical society dominated by the church. Trading in hides, not really bringing in what you needed, just trading stuff out, bringing in the luxurious goods like grapes. You know, the wine. We're saying that they grew it there, but obviously later on they couldn't. They may have got used to a lifestyle and that's what they wanted. They weren't trading in bringing seeding, and you adapted crops, which could have saved them. The Swedish Vikings were actually seeing this very much when they were dealing with Russia. Because the Swedish Vikings are said to have founded the Tsarist house of Russia, and you've got the changes. So if the Vikings are able to do it in Russia, why didn't they do it in Greenland? Probably a change in mindset in Europe. People were turning away from the church in Europe in the 1300s, but they were keeping with the church in Greenland. What was probably happening is any vessels that they had, they were stocking them full of goods, and then they didn't have any goods to feed themselves. In their reluctance to see themselves as anything but Europeans, the Greenlanders failed to adopt the kind of apparel that Inuit employed as protection against the cold and damp, or to borrow any of the Eskimo hunting gear. And if you can see a metaphor for the present situation today, it's there. People have always got to adapt to their surroundings to be part of society. They ignored the toggle harpoon, which would have allowed them to catch seals through holes in the ice in winter when food was scarce. And they seem not to even have bothered with fish hooks, which they could have fashioned easily from bone, as did the Inuits. So in other words, they didn't even go fishing. They didn't have the fish hook to fish with. This is the Norsemen, but the Inuits did. The Norsemen remained wedded to their farms and to the raising of sheep, goat, and cattle, which worsened the landscape. Now, what they should have done, they should have kept a few cattle. They should have used the dung and obviously ploughed the land and then increased their cattle, pulled that back again. You know, not a subsistence way of farming, but a mixed way of farming. And I tell you what, with experiments that we've been doing, we've been planting mixed crops. So we've got various wild plants, we've got cabbage, and we've got we've got fruit and all the rest of it. We're mixing it all together, and it really works instead of just having one crop. Finally, the birth rate declined. The young people who did come along within the population spurts in Greenland may have seen a brighter future waiting somewhere else. The depredations of the plague in Iceland and in Norway could have created vacancies overseas that able-bodied Greenlanders might have filled. So in other words, a ship goes off course and says, actually, people, there are jobs in Norway. Come on over. Come on our vessels. It's a better life. And I tell you what, I know life at sea is hard, but lots of people went to sea for example, in the 1800s, because it was far safer at sea than it was to work on agriculture on the land. And that's a fact. So maybe they saw that a lot earlier. Through the years, there may have been a slow but persistent drift of Greenlanders to those places that had been home to their ancestors, further reducing the island's dwindling population. And finally, this is a very sad ending to today's lecture. Not everyone would have left. Some must have stayed on their homesteads, unable to give up old attachments and resolved to wait out their fate. One such stoic was found lying face down on the beach of a fjord in 1540 by a party of Icelandic seafarers who, like so many sailors before them, had been blown off course on their passage to Iceland and wound up in Greenland. They described the old Norseman that they come across that day as being within a hood, homespun woolens, and with a seal skin jacket. He had fallen face down into, I would presume, the muds and the sands of the Greenlandic beach. That bit of detail. He was found face down, flesh and all. He had almost just died. And they say that nearby him was his knife. It was bent and much worn and eaten away. Moved by their find, they recorded the event. And I think in the subtext, they actually buried the body. And they actually brought the knife back as a memento. And this was the knife of probably one of the last Greenlanders that ever lived and died in 1540. Quite a sad end, that. And it does put up the hairs on the back of my neck. Pam, anything you'd like to say about that before we put on the mics?
No, I'm fine. Very interesting.
Isn't that quite sad, that last bit, though?
Yes, it is. It also leaves the mystery. Sorry about the dogs. It leaves the mystery because of the clothing and the way he was found.
Yes.
So he might have died naturally.
Yeah, no, I think this is a point. He did die naturally, and it was just like nobody was there to bury him. His wife had died, his family were dead, he was the last one, and I think that is very, very sad way to go. And the other thing as well is he was found outside on the beach, and it was just like, well, you know, it's almost as if he died a few days earlier, and it's just like an isolated Robinson Crusoe effect, where if he had just hung on for a few days, he may have died in company. And I tell you what, that brings me back to that elephant at oh God, that wildlife park in England. And it's an elephant. She's all alone. She used to be in the circus, and she's going to die alone. And I feel very sorry for that elephant. And this man's the same. I feel very sorry that he's not dying amongst the kind of his own people. He's not even being taken in by the Inuits. He just dies alone. So what we're going to do, we're going to stop the sharing, and I'm going to put the mics on. I've unmuted you all. Longleat I was thinking of. So everybody unmute their mics. Keith, would you like to say anything?
Yeah, I can't really think of anything, actually. Hopefully some of the Greenlanders went to North America and settled there. You know, you would have hoped that the last few, maybe they conjured up a boat from somewhere and managed to sail away. You know, you hope that a few of them managed to survive, but you know, there's no evidence really for what happened at all, is there? They just died out.
Yeah, we don't, you know, the archaeological sites that we do find in North America that relate to Vikings, we don't know if these are the same people that you've described. It would be nice to think that they were. I really would, Keith. And by the way, Keith, the next week's lecture is the archaeology of the Battle of the Somme.
Oh, right.
So, right, because we got loads of feedback back, let's get Karen out of the way. Anything you'd like to say, Karen?
Yeah, Jim and I have been discussing it as we've gone along.
Hang on a minute. Right, okay, go for it. What's that, Karen?
Right, I say Jim and I have been discussing it, and we think they died of shame, realising their fashions were 100 years out of date.
Oh, shut up. I'm going to mute you. Anything you would like to say, Jim? And this feedback is terrible.
Yeah, I'll talk quietly. Karen said it all.
All right, then, that's good. I'm going to mute you again. Right, what about you, Sue?
I can't help feeling rather sad that in some ways I think of myself living in a similar way, you know, just using up resources and not really living an environmentally friendly life.
Well, you're making face masks. That helps. What about you, Chris?
No, I just looking at a book from that my husband had, and he was talking about the settlement in North America, in Newfoundland. Yeah.
Nice. That's obviously the link there. Exactly. What about you, Ellen?
To add, really, it is a bit of a strange time, though, isn't it? What with all the rioting and the demonstrations, and now you give us a whole lecture on people that took over a country, decimated everything, and then died out. It's all a little bit strange.
Too near home, isn't it?
Yeah, none of these lectures in this way have been planned. You know, I hope next week.
Yeah.
I hope next week that we don't have a war breaking out in France, because that would just be really ironic. What about you, Goff?
Yeah, fantastic lecture. That well done, Carl. Well, I think it's pretty. It's a given, isn't it? They went to North America. I'd have thought.
You know, I want to truly be with Keith on Chris on that one, that they did. It would be nice to think that there is a nice end to the story, but then again, somebody else would argue, why should they have a good end to the story when they wiped out all the resources? But then again, people can change and they can learn, and it is about us. You know, we are a people, and we do deserve to be given a chance. What about you, Rosamond?
Well, I suppose the Inuits, the Skraeling, was it? They lived on.
Oh yeah, they're still there. No,
Yeah.
this is what Alan said. They're still there. They, you know, the thing is, when you look at the Inuit population, it's I think that as the testament to the Inuit, so that they are still there. They obviously got things right. And there is one other thing as well, is why would the Inuits want to have anything to do with the Greenlanders when they bring disease? Why would the Inuits want to go into the Greenlanders' homes when their civilization collapsed? Why would the Greenlanders want anything to do with... I'll start again. I've done that, I'll run. Why would the Inuits want anything to do with the Greenlanders when the Greenlanders have shown that their civilization is wrong? The Inuits wouldn't want any of their good. The Inuits wouldn't want to go into any of their homes. And the Inuits would have probably traded a little bit, but they would have probably kept away. You know, an Inuit seeing that suddenly a boat comes in and half the population is wiped out from a disease, I think the Inuits would have run a mile. But this is why the Inuits survived, because they were able to survive. And they are still there today, and that is testament to human
population. They kept their heads
population.
down and kept going in their own way.
And there is one other point as well. Sorry about that. There is one other point, that there is reference in some black books in Norway to say that the Inuits did take in some of the children whose parents had died from the plague, and that they were allowed into Inuit populations. Now, if that's the case, these Inuits are pretty nice people, as Ellen said, that they're looking after other people's children, another race's children. That horrible word, race. But
that's
in other words,
then as well, isn't
they
it?
they are the word us. They are part of humanity rather than not part of humanity. And we've already heard from Pam, if Pam wants to say anything else. But if not, have you all enjoyed the lecture today?
Yeah.
Yes.
Rubbish.
When Keith says I've done a good lecture, I know it's crap. He did say I did a good lecture once, and I got really upset afterwards. I've got to be honest with you. Right, okay, I've thoroughly enjoyed that today. Thanks for your support today. And And everyone really try and keep safe. We are trying to do our best. Anyone who does need face masks and gloves, then let us know. If we can assist in any other way. And when we do actually have walks eventually, whenever they may take place, we could bring a few books along and have a little swappable library then. But until then, keep safe, and I will see you all next Thursday. And don't do anything I wouldn't do. Thank you very much. Bye, folks. Bye, Keith. Bye, Ellen, Steve, Garth, Ross, and Jim, Karen, and Pam. Bye-bye, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Stay on for a moment, Rosamond. See you guys.
Oh, okay.
Bye.
Cheers, everybody. See you next
Bye.
week.
Ellen, I'll see you Wednesday. Oh, and I'll speak to everyone next week anyway. Oh, and Saturday. Don't forget Saturday.
Yeah. Oh, Carl?
Yeah?
Is it my stag on Saturday?
Yes.
It is, right, okay.
Are you going to join us?
Yeah, and my friend will as well.
Oh, yeah, hang on, I've got to write that down. You did say to me about 4 months ago about that one. Hang on. You did tell me. You did. I know I wrote that down. Hang on. I got to remind it because I got to send you an invite.
I'll text you it as soon as the sound is so bad.
All right, I'm reminded anyway, Karen, and I need your friend. Yeah, the email from your friend. That's good. Okay, yeah. Thanks a lot, Karen and Jim.
Right, bye.
Bye, Karen and Jim.
Bye, 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 bye.
What is the theme on Saturday night, Carl?
My stag.
My stag.